It's my privilege to welcome Chris Zepeda-Millán to the Havens Rights Center. Chris Zepeda-Millán was born and raised in East Los Angeles in the barrio of Boyle Heights. He's a political scientist and is in the departments of Public Policy and Chicano and Central American Studies, as well as the chair of Labor Studies at UCLA. His research focuses on racial politics and immigrant worker activism. Professor Zepeda-Millán is the author of 2 books, the first of which won multiple national awards, including the Charles Tilley Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Best Book Award and the American Sociological Association Best Book in Immigration Politics, and the Ralph Bunche Best Book on Ethnic Pluralism Awards from the American Political Science Association. Chris, welcome to the University of Wisconsin.
Right. So before I begin, I just want to thank Professor Marquez, Adrian, and everyone at the Havens Rights Center for inviting me. I know this has been in the works for a few years now, and something's always popped up. But I want to thank you all for not giving up and helping make this happen. So as the title of my talk here indicates, and Ben mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about and present on my first book, which is Latino Mass Mobilization, Immigration, Racialization, and Activism. And I think the way I'm going to go about it is it's kind of telling you about the broader book project, but then I'm kind of zero in on one particular chapter. But if anyone has any questions about any of the other parts of the book, I'd be happy to discuss them during the Q&A. Right? All right, so let's get started. So some of the students watching here may be too young to remember, but in the spring of 2006, from Alaska to North Carolina and Arizona to Massachusetts, the historic immigrant rights mobilization that took place really captured the nation's attention with a series of mass demonstrations and an array of forms of dissent, ranging from hunger strikes and caravans to boycotts and candlelit prayer vigils. Mothers and fathers, children and grandparents, both undocumented immigrants and U.S.-born citizens, they took to the streets that year to protest what was called the Border Protection, Anti-Terrorism, and Illegal Immigration Control Act of 2005, more commonly known as H.R. 4437, or the Sensenbrenner Bill. Among its most punitive provisions, the bill sought to increase the penalty of being undocumented from merely a civil violation into a federal felony. And if it had become law, anyone who helped undocumented immigrants, even in the most basic ways, could have been punished with thousands of dollars of fines and even incarceration. And this would have potentially criminalized everyone from priests, teachers, and social workers to unions, employers, and even the family members of undocumented immigrants. So for example, if my grandmother was undocumented and I was giving her a ride to a doctor appointment and we were pulled over, she would immediately have gone to detention and deported, and I actually could have been fined thousands of dollars and put in jail as well, right? So that's how punitive this bill was. The cycle of contention culminated with 2 of the largest episodes of collective action in American history, when up to 5 million people in almost every state of the union took part in close to 400 protests and 2 national days of action. So it's a little blurry, but what you're seeing here in blue are the protest wave lasted from about February to May of 2006. And in blue are the number of individual demonstrations that took place across the country. And in red is the size, so how many people in total were participating in actions that day here. To give you a sense of the geographic scope, right, and why I think this protest is pretty historic, is that you see here that it was a truly national protest wave, right? Here you see both the locations and the size of the demonstrations. But in terms of Latinx activism and history of activism, this is really important because, for example, the Chicano movement was pretty much limited to the Southwest, with some exceptions. If you look at Puerto Rican activism, the heart of it was really in like Chicago and New York, especially, right? So a lot of these kind of Latino groups their previous social movements have been pretty local and regional. And this was arguably the first national protest wave of Latino activism, right? So it's pretty historic. So the wave of protests was surprising, not only because the United States had not seen the likes of it since the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s, but also because of who was demonstrating. Although protests are often considered to be a form of politics used by the most marginalized members of society, actually, according to quantitative studies on political participation in the United States, due to a supposed lack of resources and civic skills, it's actually not the poor or racial minorities, but white middle and upper class American citizens who were found to be most likely to be targeted for and to actually take part in electoral politics and political activism. Yet in the spring of 2006, it was immigrants of color and their families, the vast majority of who were Latinx, that were the ones demonstrating. And this was particularly interesting given that Latino immigrant communities are usually portrayed as being poor and under-resourced. And not surprisingly, given what we know about the relationship between socioeconomic status and political behavior, scholars have continuously found that Latinx people and Latinx immigrants in particular to be among the least likely to participate in political protests. Many social movement scholars were equally baffled by the marches, given that the dominant paradigms in this literature, which have traditionally relegated the role of grievances to secondary factors, could also not completely explain these unexpected mass mobilizations. For example, resource mobilization theorists have long argued that the presence of professional social movement organizations or SMOs and that resources from external actors such as foundations or national organizations are vital for collective action to take place. In addition, political process theorists agree on the importance of SMOs, but they add that it's the confluence of this, what they call like an expanding political opportunity structure, which often we measure by things such as which political party is in office or what current public opinion on an issue is, right? That these factors are also key to the mobilization and movement building process. The 2006 demonstration seemed to complicate these theories, given that many of the protests happened in unlikely places, such as the rural U.S. South, right? They're places with really no prior history of Latinx immigrant activism and without the existence of any real SMOs. On top of this, the fact that the marches took place in a seemingly constricting, if not outright closed, political opportunity structure with an anti-immigrant Republican Party in control of every branch of the federal government at the time, and still arguably a nativist post 9/11 political context, I think further complicates social movement theory's explanations of when and how large-scale collective action emerges. So neither the established American political behavior, social movement, or Latinx politics literatures were equipped to fully explain the historic 2006 protest wave. As a group of senior political scientists put it at the time, quote, "Almost nothing we know about Latinos from the work of social scientists and humanists would have predicted these events," unquote. So given these theoretical puzzles, the three main research questions that my book aims to help answer are first, what accounts for the sudden rise and abrupt decline of the mass demonstrations? And if you remember that graph, you kind of see like it hits the two big peaks, which were I think it was the April 10th National Day of Action for Immigrant Justice and the May 1st Great American Boycott, more popularly known as the Day Without an Immigrant. That kind of happened May 1st, and after that, the protest kind of disappeared, right? So why? Second, how can we begin to understand and theorize the varying levels of mobilization, not only in different geographic locations, but also amongst different immigrant groups? And third, what, if any, impacts, right, did the protest wave contribute to? Now, I went about researching these questions through a process tracing approach of multiple case studies, utilizing data from over 130 in-depth interviews conducted between 2006 and 2009 of both local and national protest organizers and coalition members of of various racial and ethnic backgrounds in the cities of Los Angeles, New York, Fort Myers, Florida, and Washington, D.C. So I mentioned earlier, right, that there were close to 400 demonstrations. That's a part of the protest wave. So why did I choose these locations? My case studies locations were selected for theoretical reasons. Los Angeles was chosen because if immigrant mass mobilization was going to occur, according to social movement theory, it would be expected to, and it actually did happen in a place like LA because of its large immigrant population, its long history of immigrant activism, and the plethora of immigrant rights groups that exist all across the metropolitan area. Now, for these same reasons, I selected New York to study, but unlike Los Angeles and other major immigrant metropolises such as Chicago and Dallas, all of which had demonstrations of over 500,000 people, New York, which has an even larger immigrant population and more immigrant rights groups than cities, was able to muster only demonstrations of 30,000 to 100,000, right? So, and to be fair, I think any social movement wishes they could, would love to be able to mobilize 30,000 to almost 100,000 people. But again, this is relative to other major immigrant cities that were happening, protests that were happening across the country. And this is a question that, as you'll see in a moment, even New York organizers are asking themselves, like, why can't we mobilize more people like the way other big cities are? All right, so in short, New York was selected because it relatively underperformed in the protest wave. Fort Myers was chosen because it was an unexpected location for immigrant mass mobilization. Not only was the region considered a quote-unquote new immigrant receiving destination at the time, but it also had virtually no immigrant rights organizational infrastructure or really established history of immigrant activism in the city. Yet the city of 60,000 people with only a 10% Latino population hosted a demonstration of 80 to over 100,000 immigrants, right? So that doesn't make sense. And we could talk about like where all those immigrants came from and why they chose Fort Myers, right? But Fort Myers, again, was an instance of where large-scale immigrant collective action was not expected to happen, but yet did occur, right? And lastly, I conducted interviews with national labor, business, civil rights, pro and anti-immigrant national leaders and lobbyists based in Washington, D.C. mostly, in order to examine some of the impacts that these individuals believe the protest wave had on their lobbying efforts and on the policymaking process, right? Because they had all been lobbying and trying to pass or prevent immigration reform before the protests, right, which caught them by surprise as well, right? So I wanted to get a sense of how they felt the protest wave impacted their lobbying efforts. Okay, there goes. So I supplemented my interview data with information that I gathered from newspapers, both Spanish and language newspapers, protest flyers, census and other survey data, as well as movement websites and emails and secondary scholarly sources. Oh, sorry, it keeps freezing. Okay. All right. So the main findings that I had in terms of in the West Coast, East Coast, and the southern cities that I examined revealed several common themes. For instance, I found that when nativist legislative threats, such as the Simpson-Brenner bill, when they simultaneously impact the identity and the material interests of immigrants and their recent descendants, this could trigger a political backlash, not only on the streets, but also in the ballot box. From both people without papers, and we could talk about the ways in which undocumented immigrants have participated in electoral politics, but also electorally armed naturalized immigrants and U.S.-born citizens of recent immigrant descent. Second, and as I'll talk more about in a moment, my interviews with African, European, Asian, Latinx immigrants and U.S.-born activists revealed that immigrant illegality was racialized as generally Latinx, but more specifically as Mexican, not only by the broader or general American public, as several other scholars have shown, but also by Latinx and other racialized immigrant groups themselves. Third, I found that diverse coalitions, the utilization of pre-existing community resources and ethnic media outlets all played key roles in the mobilization processes of every case study location that I examined. And finally, the results of my study also indicate that the historic demonstrations had both direct and indirect impact. The immediate effects were that while they helped stop HR 4437 from becoming law, the protests also virtually guaranteed that no legalization for undocumented immigrants would get passed because they further polarized an already divided Republican-controlled Congress. But with regards to the more indirect and long-term impacts, I show how the organizational infrastructure and networks that were built during these marches later helped lay the groundwork for the massive and historic 2008 Latino immigrant naturalization, voter registration, and get out the vote drives that we saw. That also arguably contributed to electing our first African-American president. So let me give you just a quick summary of the book. And again, if anyone has any questions about these, I'd be happy to talk about them during the Q&A. So in the introduction, I lay out my theoretical argument. I explain the same puzzle that I did to you all earlier, right? And I summarize my findings quickly. But in chapter 1, I argue that this protest can't be seen in a vacuum, right? That there's been a long history of immigrant activism, and they could arguably trace the roots of the undocumented migrant rights movement to the Southwest and Los Angeles. And I show how those movements kind of laid the groundwork and helped spread. And also all contextual factors such as border militarization and the spread of undocumented migration all over the country also helped lay the groundwork for this kind of the first national immigrant rights mobilizations. In chapter 2, Weapons of the Not So Weak, here I use a case study of Fort Myers, Florida, to look at, how did these random mom and pop businesses, a soccer league, immigrant farm workers, nannies get together and organize one of the largest demonstrations in the protest wave in the U.S. South, right? And I look at how they tapped into there and activated their pre-existing resources, community resources to do that. Chapter 3, promoting protest through ethnic media. Here I use the case of Los Angeles, California, which has not only the largest Spanish language, but just the largest ethnic media market in the country. And this is actually one of the things that got me hooked onto this topic, because I went to graduate school at Cornell in upstate New York, and I was about to fly back, from LA to Ithaca, and I was watching Univision on the mainstream Spanish language news station with my grandmother, and I see a commercial that has all the main, I guess, how could I put it? They had all the main news anchors of all the big Spanish language stations. So imagine the main news anchors of ABC, NBC, and CBS. All of them locking arms, saying on Saturday, we march for our people, we march for our children, we march for our dignity. And they all say, march, march, march. And then they show the time and location of the protest. And I was like, what is this? A graduate student studying social movements, I was like, I've never seen a mainstream news outlet promote a protest, right? I mean, I guess now we have Fox News that does it for the right, but this is not cable. This is a mainstream thing. So I ended up canceling my flight to go to this demonstration. And you had all the major radio stations, news stations talking about it. Activists were on this for weeks promoting the march, framing the march, sometimes exaggerating, the implications. But nonetheless, in this chapter, I investigate how the social movement basically appropriated these mass channels of communication and the power that has. Chapter 4, coalitions and the racialization of illegality is what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. And again, I look at the case study of New York, which is a super diverse immigrant population, and I examine why it relatively underperformed. Chapter 5, the suppression of immigrant contention. Here I look at how, and I argue that we need to look at, and I give examples of how immigration enforcement policies could be understood as forms of anti-immigrant forms of movement repression and suppression. Right. So I show how during the protest wave, these mass workplace raids and deportations that the Bush administration launched helped create a backlash even amongst the immigrant population against activists and immigrants saying, hey, this happened because you all called for these protests, right? And how that made them scared to continue to march. Today we march, tomorrow we vote. I look at the institutionalization of the movement and how it moved from the streets to the ballot box, and some of the complications with that, and the people that were left out of some of those campaigns. But lastly, I closed the book, talking about some of the implications and I'm doing somewhat of a comparative analysis of these cities. And so again, happy to talk about any of these chapters during the Q&A. So I want to focus the rest of my talk today primarily on the relationship between how the ways in which immigration policy is racialized could impact immigrant large-scale collective action. But I'll also make some few comments regarding multiracial coalitions that if you have any questions about, I'd be happy to, again, go further into later. And I want to discuss these issues using the case of New York City for chapter 4. So again, why New York? As I mentioned earlier, the city relatively underperformed, and that was one of the main reasons why I decided to investigate it. Arguably the longest history of immigrant activism, tons of immigrant rights organizations in every borough, and it had the largest immigrant population in the city. Another interesting question about New York City was why different immigrant groups mobilized to different degrees, right? So if you look at the city's actions and see videos of it and speeches, you'll see how diverse these protests were. Right. And despite the fact that all undocumented immigrants and even some documented ones were going to be affected by the bill in New York, organizers of various racial and ethnic backgrounds told me that the rallies were heavily Mexican and heavily Dominican. Right. And although the Dominican participation might not be that surprising, given that they're the city's the largest immigrant group in the city, I'll explain in a few moments why the degree of Mexican participation was interesting. And I believe was the examining. With regards to coalitions, since at least the 1960s, both activists and academics have constantly argued that multiracial coalitions are fundamental to minority political empowerment. Yet, at least at the time that I was conducting this study, there was a growing body of research showing that rather than coalition, it may actually be conflict and competition that are the dominant relationships between communities of color. Because of this, I believe that when multiracial coalitions are formed, I think it's important that we understand why and how they develop, especially those of us who support those coalitions and take part in them. So what were my main findings regarding these questions? My research shows that in the case of New York's 2006 protest, the draconian and far-reaching nature of the Sensenbrenner bill was able to bring organizations and activists of a variety of both political as well as racial and ethnic backgrounds together to form these diverse coalitions that coordinated the city's protest. For example, Guari Sohwani of the New York Civic Participation Project said, HR 4437 criminalized whole sectors of our society that supported or in any way provided services to undocumented immigrants. It really challenged not just the people that were here without papers, but in some ways our entire social fabric that allows for immigrants, regardless of whether they're documented or undocumented, to be part of our society. Hector Figueroa, who unfortunately recently passed away, and he's one of the legendary leaders of SEIU 32BJ in New York, said, quote, "The institutions and networks that we had put in place before, fighting police brutality, fighting for immigration reform, fighting for language access and city services, it was those networks that immediately connected people." Right? But if local activists of various racial and ethnic backgrounds were united over the severity of this policy threat, why then did different immigrant groups mobilize to different degrees? So according to my findings, a major factor was the degree to which different immigrant groups felt threatened by the proposed legislation. For example, one European immigrant activist who wanted to remain anonymous explained to me, quote, "There's an estimated 50,000 Russian Jews that are undocumented in New York City. But when it comes to being attacked as immigrants, they don't really feel those attacks apply to them, partly because they're white." Munami Malik, who was the head of the largest Muslim South Asian organization, said, quote, "It was much tougher to mobilize in the South Asian community, and I think also in non-Latino communities, because HR 4437 was very much seen as a Latino thing. The media portrayed it as only a Mexican thing. So non-Latinos stayed away from the protest." And Hai Young from CAV, which is a really prominent Asian organization, said, quote, many Chinatown residents felt that the Sense of Bernardo just really didn't affect them. Right? She helped lead a coalition in New York City's Chinatown. So despite the fact that all undocumented immigrants would have technically been impacted by the Sense of Bernardo bill, many documented and undocumented immigrants in non-Latinx and non-Mexican immigrant communities, they believe that this particular anti-quote-unquote illegal immigrant bill didn't really affect them. And there were several factors that non-Latinx activists said impacted their community's lack of participation in the demonstrations. So, for example, one factor was the different previous experiences that these immigrant groups have had in the United States. The best example of this is Muslim immigrants after 9/11, right? There was, for some of you that study immigration policy might remember, we had something called special registration, which is basically disappearing hundreds of immigrants from all across the country. These Muslim immigrants were getting letters to show up to immigration office, and when they did, they're immediately deported. They weren't allowed to tell their families. It'd be sometimes days or weeks before their family knew what happened. They just know they didn't come home from work, right? Some of these Muslim organizations, including Drum in New York City, they were raided by the FBI. The computers were taken with all the names of their members, and all their members' files were taken by the FBI. Right, so some of these organizations are like, I'm trying to like not draw attention from me, right? I might disagree with this protest, but it's not really about me, and I don't want to risk based on what's happened to me before, right? So previous experiences in the U.S. seem to have mattered. Another factor is previous experiences that some immigrant groups had in their countries of origin. For example, many Taiwanese and mainland Chinese immigrants showed up to the big first National Day of Action on April 10th. You know, all of them was this big United Chinatown coalition. But then when May 1st came around, all the Taiwanese organizations pulled back and they didn't want to participate because they associated May Day, International Workers' Day, with communist China, right? So they didn't want to be seen as supporting anything that could be related to communist China, right? So that kind of broke, that previous homeland experience kind of broke off some of the coalition members here. European or immigrants from former communist Eastern European countries also, you know, some of them told me things like, the government forced me to go to rallies and marches before. Now that I have freedom in the United States, why would I purposely or want to go to one? You know, that doesn't work. That's all staged, right? So those previous experiences impacted their willingness to participate here in the United States. And lastly, the fact that different immigrant groups have different policy interests, I believe, also likely played a factor. For example, when I talked to these different immigrant rights organizations in the city, African and Asian immigrant rights groups, they said that clearing the visa backlog was their most important priority for their policy priority, not really deportations or border militarization. They didn't really care about that, right? You felt like that didn't really affect them. Nonetheless, according to local organizers in non-Latinx communities, even when they did have sizable undocumented populations in their groups, many non-Mexican immigrant communities didn't realize that the policy interests were going to be, that their own personal policy interests were going to be impacted by the proposed legislation. Again, they saw the Sensenbrenner bill or HR 4437 as only impacting Latinos in general and Mexicans in particular. And as I argue later in the chapter, I believe that these findings illustrate how certain immigration policies, in this case, those related to illegality, how they become racialized, not only in the minds of the broader white American public, as several other scholars have shown, but also amongst immigrants themselves. And I think these findings may also help explain or provide some clues to why Dominicans and Mexicans seem to have been overrepresented at the demonstration. Right. So, for example, Moises Perez used to be the president of the largest Dominican organization in the city. When I asked him to tell me what the marches were like, you know, and who showed up, he said the Dominicanos are the largest immigrant groups in the New York area. But there was a lot of Mexicans there. It was like, wow, right? So what he went on to tell me was that, like, of course, it makes sense that Dominicans were going to be there. We're the biggest immigrant group, you know, so that matters, right? There, just their sheer size. But also, as we talked, he kept mentioning how there was a series of laws that passed in 1996, immigration laws that passed, that criminalized immigrants and that were retroactive, right? So there's a lot of instances, for example, of people who came to the United States as immigrants, and maybe they got caught with like a shoplifting or with a marijuana joint when they were like 13 years old or something. They might be 40, 50-year-old parents, or in one case, a pastor who was now being deported retroactively because of what he had done, minor offense that he had done, that this law made deportable. Right. So when the protests were calling for legalization or stop of deportations, right, it resonated with, I would say, to some degree with the Dominicans in New York. But as this quote points out, there was a surprisingly significant presence of Mexican immigrants at the rallies, as a local South Asian activist described the crowd. Mexican, definitely Mexican, a lot of Mexican flags. Right. So although this might not be surprising to someone like me from California or the Southwest, where Mexicans are the largest immigrant group, and the degree of Mexican participation in New York City, it actually challenges some of the traditional social movement and political participation literatures for several reasons. One is that Mexicans are notoriously underorganized in the cities, right? They don't have a lot of, if you do research on immigrant activism in New York, there's going to be like, tons of, several Haitian organizations, several Dominican organizations, almost every national origin group has a lot of organizations. And at the time, at least, that really wasn't the case when it came to Mexicans, right? So it didn't have that social movement organizational infrastructure. Also, Mexicans as an immigrant group had the lowest socioeconomic status amongst all immigrant groups in New York City. They had the least level of education. They had the highest poverty rate in the city. And for those of you who know the American political participation literature, at least at the time, right, we know from several quantitative studies that actually the more educated you are, the more financial resources, the higher your income is, the more likely you are to participate in politics and activism. And here we had the opposite, right? The poorest of the poor in New York were the ones turning out. It also couldn't be sheer numbers, right? Because I've hinted at before, Dominicans had way more larger numbers than Mexicans. So did Chinese immigrants, so did Guyanese immigrants, and Ecuadorian, Haitian, Trinidadian immigrants all had about the same amount of numbers of immigrants as Mexicans did. Quantitative studies also show that Latinos and new immigrant receiving destinations are less likely to participate in protests, right? And Mexicans at the time were arguably, New York was arguably a new immigrant receiving destination, right? So they're less likely to protest in places like this. Yet, according to the director of one of the only Mexican-based NGOs in the city, which is really a Catholic church-based organization, Brother Joel explained to me, quote, usually to organize a mobilization, we have to set up a meeting. We have to explain to people in each community, in each church, what we're going to do, why we're going to do it, etc. But that year, we didn't have to mobilize. Mexican immigrants moved on their own. Right, and as I found in my other case study city, Mexican immigrants in New York City, they didn't need to be reminded that the issue of illegal immigration was racialized as a Mexican one, meaning that people of Mexican descent, both U.S. and foreign-born, seemed to understand quite well that anti-illegal meant anti-them, right? And I think these results also help us understand why, compared to other major immigrant metropolises such as LA, Dallas, and Chicago, New York relatively underperformed. So according to a longtime immigrant rights organizer in New York, Arti Shahani of Families for Freedom, she said, quote, there's a question to be asked of New York, which is why wouldn't we have had the largest march in the country? All right, and again, this is an important question to ask because New York, tons of immigrant rights organizations, the largest immigrant population in the city, and a history of immigrant activism, right? And I think the results of my study suggest that because the Sensenbrenner bill was being racialized as an anti-Mexican policy proposal, cities where Mexicans made up larger portions of the undocumented population and where people of Mexican descent made up a significant amount of the total population produced the largest demonstrations in the protest, right? So getting statistics on undocumented populations is notoriously difficult, right? So I had to kind of scramble to find any clues I could And I think, there's some suggestive stats I was able to find. So for example, here, this is the size of the Mexican origin population in the cities that had the largest, some of the largest demonstrations in the protest wave, right? And you see here, right, that, Dallas, Chicago, and especially Los Angeles, the Mexican descent, both foreign and U.S. core population, is just much larger than in New York City, right? So, and if a policy proposal is being racialized as anti-Mexican, that just put, a larger pool of people that might be offended by that rhetoric. I also found some data on the New York foreign-born population by region, by what percent of the foreign population are foreign-born and which percent are not citizens, right? Again, not perfect data regarding undocumented, but I still think tells us something, right? So if you look at Caribbean immigrants that made up 30% of all immigrants in New York, more than half of them are not citizens, right? You see the similar demographics for South American, Central American, looking at continents, Asia, Africa, Europe, right? In terms of all of them, almost all of them at least had larger populations that I was able to kind of pull out, just look at Mexico in the city. Mexicans only make up 6% of all immigrants in New York City at the time, but 90% of them are not citizens, right? So that was a clue that something's going on there. And research by Doug Massey at Princeton and others have shown that most post-1990 Mexican migration, almost all of it was undocumented, right? And if you look at when Mexican immigration really took off in New York City, it was really post-1990s phenomenon, right? So those are some more clues. Lastly, here I was able to get data on the characteristics of undocumented immigrants by metro area, right? So this is the percent of foreign-born immigrants, all immigrants in these cities that are undocumented, their actual number, and the percent of those undocumented who are Mexican. So Dallas, 48% of all immigrants are undocumented at the time, and they totaled almost 500,000. 75% of those 460,000 were Mexican. Chicago, about a third of all their immigrants were undocumented, 400,000 in total. 88% were Mexican in Chicago. LA, a little more than a fourth of the immigrants are undocumented, but they have estimated around 1 million undocumented people in LA, and almost 60% are Mexicans. When you look at New York, though, the issue of illegality, right, affects a smaller portion of all immigrants. It's only 16%. They still have over 500,000 undocumented immigrants, though, right? When you look at the percent of undocumented people there that are Mexican, it's only 20%. There's a lot of undocumented immigrants in New York City, right? That are undocumented, right? Which made me ask, the different people that I interviewed about that, right? So, despite that, New York, according to the organizers that I interviewed, had a significant amount of Asian, European, and English-speaking Caribbean undocumented populations. According to these organizers who lead these NGOs that work with these communities, they didn't feel as threatened by the proposed legislation as Mexicans did, even though they should have, right? Undocumented is undocumented. Thus, in the actual chapter, I argue that these dynamics likely played a role in New York's performance in the protest wave. And I contend that cities like LA, Chicago, and New York produced larger protests because more people in these cities felt more individually threatened because undocumented immigration is a bigger issue in Mexican communities, and more collectively threatened because of how the issue is being racialized compared to New York. So what are some of the implications of these findings and the larger books projects from which they're drawn? So I believe there's at least 4 worth noting. Sorry, my clicking is a little delayed here. Okay. First is that diversity impacts organizing in many ways, right? You ask any organizer, is it easier to organize one homogeneous group or a big diverse coalition, right? Different groups are going to have different policy interests. They're going to be comfortable with different tactics and strategies, right? Again, based on previous experience, based on their experiences in the US and their home countries, et cetera. They're going to have different degrees of perceived levels of threat, right? And again, I argue, and that might impact their levels of mobilization. Because of the ways in which immigration policy is racialized, my work shows that immigrant quote-unquote illegality can be understood differently by different immigrant groups, despite their actual legal and citizenship status. And I believe my research also highlights the importance of unpacking these broad racialized labels, such as immigrant, such as Latino, such as quote unquote illegal, right? By helping us understand what context and how they become conflated and construction through political contestation, and how the meaning of these labels can have different political consequences for different groups. I think my work also helps expand the contours of research on Latinx politics, which tends to primarily rely on survey data and focus on voting and naturalization. You all have one of the only Latinx political scientists, Professor Marquez, who kind of has helped expand our notion of Latino politics through his kind of historical political research. But that's really rare in Latino politics, usually all survey data. So I think my work shows that even those, or this particular book shows that even those who can't vote and can't naturalize, such as legal permanent residents, such as undocumented immigrants, they engage in the policymaking process and are not just subject to it. Second, in the book, I think it illustrates how that Latino politics also happens on the streets, and that what happens on the streets can impact what happens at the ballot box and also in the halls of Congress. Third, I believe my work also shows that using interviews, archives, and ethnographic data could really help highlight some of the key mechanisms linking established quantitative findings, such as the positive correlation, statistical correlations that have been found between the participation of people of Mexican descent in political activism related to immigration issues. So with that said, thank you all for listening. I'll leave you with a few pictures of flyers from both the protests in New York and Los Angeles, which I think nicely illustrate the types of demographics and demographic context that the organizers had to try to operate under, right? You see it, they had, in New York, there on the left, they had to translate it in a bunch of different languages. In LA, it was one flyer, 2 languages, English and Spanish. The colors are basically the colors of the Mexican flag, red, white, and green, right? But with that said, I'll be happy to take any questions.
My question was, earlier you talked about like Fort Myers and how more protesters went there than even the population of the city. And I was just wondering why places like that had so much of a larger turnout than places like New York.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I have to say, like, how did this happen? These numbers might be completely wrong, are they relying on activists? And I went to look, it was actually the police and newspapers that are with those projections. And when I went out to do the interview there, I ended up finding out that it wasn't just the local population. It was kind of this regional, the southwest part of Florida that mobilized through not only these mom and pop organizations, but through this network of immigrant soccer leagues. And they chose Fort Myers because Fort Myers is where I believe his name was Congressman Connie Mack had his office there, and he was one of the biggest supporters of the Sensenbrenner bill. So they chose it to symbolize, like, to target Connie Mack. But they actually came from all over the region, which makes a lot more sense. Like, how did they get there? Fort Myers has such a small Latinx population.
Hi, Chris. Fellow Bruin here. I was really interested in that comment that you made about, I think, with the church organizer that said that they typically have to do. Sorry if you hear a lot of background noise on that. But they typically have to do hold multiple meetings and give information out to different people about what we're doing, why, and all that. I was wondering how but he said in New York that they didn't have to do that with Mexican immigrants. I just was curious. I'm in red school event. I train teachers to work with Chicano and Latino immigrant students. And I was curious how you theorize, if you theorize, and so how, and just your thoughts about that dynamic, the kind of self-learning, if you might say it that way, right? That Mexican immigrants do, and I'm assuming I can guess where they get information about that stuff, but the fact that oftentimes the church has to organize meetings, and in this particular case they didn't. I'm curious about, like, in practice, that probably there's certain things that they did, but I'm curious about you and studying this. Like, how do you theorize that? I don't know how else to call it, but like in ed, self self self-guided learning, self-initiated
Yeah.
learning. That's a huge
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I would give that credit to ethnic media outlets, right? I was surprised ethnic media outlets and the way movement could both spread and impact people's identities from afar when they could relate. So, for example, in New York and Fort Myers, when I would ask where they got the idea to mobilize, they kept saying like, "Well, that was that big march in LA or that big march in Chicago," you know. And you know, in places like Fort Myers, they would say like, "We feel really isolated here. There's no like Mexican neighborhood. We're all kind of spread around in different farm fields." You know, but when we saw what happened in Los Angeles, we felt empowered, like we were part of that. That was us, and we had to do it here, right? So somehow they went from feeling like minorities, you know, isolated in Fort Myers to being like, hey, we're part of this bigger, stronger collective. And if everything's okay over there when they're protesting, it should be okay here. In New York, you know, again, Univision, a lot of them were getting their information there. I will say there was a diversity of perspectives on radio stations in New York that reflected the diversity of the Latino immigrant population there that you didn't really see in LA. In LA, it was like all the radio stations were united. They actually formed their own coalition. But people like Piolín, for example, which is a popular Mexican radio DJ in LA, he was nationally syndicated. A lot of the LA, these Mexican music stations are nationally syndicated. So people in New York, the Mexicans in New York City and Fort Myers are listening to the frames of LA organizers, the way they're talking about it, right? And I think that informed them, right? So the church I was talking about, they were saying like, we were getting calls asking us like, hey, Father, are you going to be at the march? So they were telling the priest, like, are you going to be there? I'll see you there, right? They were kind of auto-mobilizing, which you didn't really see in a lot of other communities. So I would say ethnic media outlets played a key role, and the way and the activists were able to get access to these ethnic media outlets, the way they their frames resonated. I don't know if that answers your question. I guess that's the way they would learn.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. Armando, please go ahead and unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and ask your question.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. What a brilliant presentation on Latinx, Latina, and Latina social movements. Thank you, Chris, for talking about it. As a person that participated in Southern California in 2006, and actually had to deal with the leader of the Minutemen out in Orange County for quite some time. It's interesting when we talk about the framing of illegality, especially around the Mexican immigrant question, right? Or the Mexican question, which is something that I think it's well documented in most of at least the social movement literature. My question is quite simple. It's, you know, I was in discussions with a colega here from Chicago, and she was talking, we were having the debate as to who had the largest rally, right? Was it in Chicago or was it in LA, right? Or was it even in Milwaukee? You know, thanks to HR 4437, I think it was, which is, you know, one of those badge of honors that Wisconsin had that put it forward, Sensenbrenner, that coalesced this whole movement. And so the question is about social movement organizations and coalitions. We know that social movement organizations, especially the coalition building that had been built up in 2001 to try to get comprehensive immigration reform was becoming mature. And so by 2006, when this all happened, I mean, there was already established, you know, labor, immigrant, and other social movement organizations that had coalesced together around this issue. I'm not very well aware of the New York question. I can tell you that we assigned your chapter on Nueva York in our social movements class here, and it really opened up a lot of eyes for our students with regards to just the level of complexity that LA had at the time and what seems to be low social movement organizational capacity in Nueva York. Not so much the low number of people. Would you say that's the case?
There was some background noise. I'm not sure I got the question completely right, but I think it has to do with New York and kind of their movement infrastructure. I actually think that New York had one of the most dynamic immigrant rights movement at the time. They were doing amazing organizing with restaurant workers, taxi workers. So if you're kind of looking at before 2006, where some of the most dynamic organizing was happening with immigrants, I would say probably New York was at the top of this, right? That's one way to think about social movements, right? And I don't, this is just, I would not want to measure social movements by whether they exist or not or are good enough by this mass mobilization, right? This is one action, right? One series of actions. So to me, I think what was interesting was that I would say New York had one of the most exciting, dynamic, and diverse immigrant rights organizations. And yet, I would expect it to have probably be, and the organizers I interviewed in New York, one of them started off my interview saying, okay, I know you want to talk about the protest. I know we suck, New York, and I was like, wait, no. But because they expected themselves to have the largest, they had that cocky New York attitude of like, we're the best immigrant rights movement and we're going to have the biggest protest. And then they actually came late to the protest wave also. There had been small protests bubbling in all the other cities, and New York hadn't had any. All right, so they came late to the protest wave, and they had still a good size, but relatively, smaller compared to other cities, despite their large population. So I think that was actually part of the puzzle. They had the social movement organizations there. They had the history and the networks. But it was hard for all of these groups to mobilize to the same degree. That when you talk about immigrant activism in LA, for the most part, the majority of it's Mexican and Central American, right? There's some other really important groups like Koreans, Filipinos, but in terms of sheer numbers, it's really an undocumented immigrant rights issue that's embedded in the Mexican and Central American communities. Right. And what I learned in New York, it's a lot harder to organize. And populations are so diverse. Right. So again, I don't know if that was your exact question, and I think it had something to do with the organization. But I will argue that LA had way bigger protests than Chicago, but that Chicago had, along with Milwaukee, they had the first big ones that actually grabbed the national attention. Everyone's like, what's happening? And I know for a fact through my interviews that LA organizers saw Chicago's march as a challenge. They're like, oh, Chicago could do that. We could do it too, right? And they were inspired, and Chicago organizers came to LA to talk about what happened, right? So there's a lot of this kind of movement sharing and overlap and inspiration and learning, that took place.
Thanks for that. Lucy Kennedy has a question. She writes, there have been many bills and acts in the U.S. that have affected immigrants over the past many years. What struck you and what precipitated your interest to study the effects of this particular bill?
Mm-hmm. Great question. That was one of the puzzles, right? And this is why I mentioned, across the country, the threat, the policy proposal was definitely seen as a racialized anti-Mexican one. Like whenever I would ask people basically, why did you participate? Like, oh, it was really racist. It was against Mexicans, blah, 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 right? But I knew that there, as an immigration scholar, I knew there was a lot of other anti-immigrant policies, some of which, for example, in Florida that had just recently passed, and there was no mass mobilizations, right? So when I would ask them like, okay, yeah, so that makes sense. It's anti-immigrant, it's anti-Mexican, so why you participated. And then I'd give them a list like, so this was also a recent anti-immigrant law, nationally, statewide. Why didn't you mobilize then, right? And what a lot of these organizers told me, and I would say they kind of get mad when I talk about this part of my findings, because they're like, well, that makes us look kind of self-interested. But they really did say things like, and this is across the country. They're like, well, that law was different because that was targeting undocumented immigrants by themselves. The Sensenbrenner bill was attacking everyone associated with them. So my NGO would not exist. We'd have to shut down if this passed. So in New York, for example, and all across, you've never seen this before. Every immigrant rights organization or immigrant serving organization, medical clinics, stopped everything they were doing to mobilize their constituencies to go out to stop their bill, because they themselves would have been criminalized, right? And I pushed back and argued, not argue with them, but I pushed back okay, so this leads me to another question. If you look at raids and deportations from the Bush administration, they actually increased after the protest wave, and yet there was no major mass mobilization. This is also after Sensenbrenner had been blocked, right? So I'll ask, okay, so once you all were out of the direct line of fire, you stopped calling for mobilizations, but undocumented immigrants were arguably more threatened and under attack after the Sensenbrenner bill, right? And the answer that I got from them and from national organizers is like, yes, but although the protests were super empowering and inspiring, we had 5 million people marching on the streets, and then we went to DC to be like, see, we have power. And then what did they find out? People from, members of Congress from Wisconsin, from all other places saying like, that was 5 million illegals marching. They have nothing to do with whether I stay in office or not, right? They're not voters. I care more about the 10,000 phone calls I got saying you better not pass immigration reform. Right? So 10,000 phone calls were more powerful in Congress than 5 million people out on the streets. So the immigrant rights movement, according to my interviews with what some of these leaders said, we saw the limits of protest, and we needed to show that our protests were backed up by electoral power, right? So that when we're marching out on the streets, they don't just see, these brown faces that can't vote, that they know, oh, that means something. Last point on this is that it happened in California. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's historically a bigot, she was going to support the Sensenbrenner bill, right? The senator of California was going to support the Sensenbrenner bill, according to all the lobbyists in DC I talked to. After March 25th, the million people marching in Los Angeles, she switched her opinion and she's now against it because she saw 1 million Latino voters in LA and she knew that they vote, right? So both in Democrats and Republicans, I think the movements felt that they had to show that there's electoral power beyond this, and that's when they shifted their focus.
Thank you very much. That's really fascinating and disturbing. Rishi, please go ahead, turn on your camera and ask your question.
Hi, Chris. Thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed the talk. I was a community organizer at the time of the 2006 march, organizing Latino and Black communities in Oakland. And your talk and your book both resonate a lot with our experience. We were doing all kinds of deep organizing around gentrification in Oakland, and all of a sudden this march happened, and we knew, a lot of the people that were sort of driving some of the street mobilizations, but it was like a whole separate thing from the work we were doing, which was both disheartening and also really inspiring all at the same time. And so appreciate the book. I'm writing my dissertation on sort of on a Latino neighborhood in Chicago and the declining salience of race and racial politics in this neighborhood. I'm moving to LA for a postdoc in the fall, so it'd be good to talk to you, meet in person in the fall. But two questions that are on my mind. One, I'm wondering if you can just talk a bit more about what you know about how older immigrant cohorts were responding to the call to the march, and especially sort of how they were responding to sort of the racialized dimensions of both the attack and the sort of organizing happening from below. So like third, fourth, fifth generation, in particular, what you know about the sort of Mexicanos in those older cohorts. And then I just wanted to ask a bit more about the racialization dimensions of it. So beyond the radio stations, which were sort of so vital to these mobilizations, can you just talk a bit more about what you view as the background conditions for people to sort of view the Sensenbrenner bill as anti-Mexican, right? Because I think you're right, like the finding, the sort of observation that people that it landed on people in that way is totally right. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about what it was that allowed people to experience it that way, like the specific things that, and beyond the organizations, if you're able to speak to sort of, mobilization participants. Was it, people's participation in organizations? Was it some, deeply embedded sense of history? Kind of, if you're able to speak to background conditions for racialization, that'd be great.
Yeah, so background conditions first, I think is a good place to start. So during this time, there was a lot of things happening. It wasn't just the Sensenbrenner bill, right? There was a huge effect. There's all these examples for so the Republican Party, it's really hard for them, to stay on cue when they're attacking undocumented immigrants. Their rhetoric and discourse went from undocumented immigrants to immigrants in general, to what they were calling the browning of America, right? So there's for example, during this time, there was a basketball game in San Antonio, Texas, with the San Antonio Spurs, And the person who was going to sing the national anthem dropped out last minute. There was a mariachi festival happening outside. So they got a Mexican-American kid to come in to sing the national anthem. He sang it, but he was in his charro suit. Huge backlash all over Fox News. This is so anti-American. They let a kid, a brown kid, sing the national anthem in a Mexican suit, which was a mariachi thing. He sang it in English, everything, but completely attacked all over Fox News. The rhetoric on the right-wing media went from anti-undocumented to anti-bilingual education. They started talking about. They had people on the news, like there was a recent book that was published called Mexifornia that was super nativist. Samuel Huntington at the time, which was a famous Harvard professor, right? He's actually credited for predicting that the West and Islam were going to, that was going to be the biggest challenge after the Cold War. Well, before he died, he wrote this book called, I think, Who Are We? And he said the biggest national security threat in the United States is not terrorists, it's Mexicans, because they don't assimilate. And if you look at Los Angeles, when there's a World Cup game there, most of these people that show up are from Mexico, and they were born in the U.S., right? And you have these scary Chicano studies departments that are politicizing them, and they have this Reconquista plan where they're going to take back the Southwest. So there was a whole bunch of racist rhetoric happening, right? And that spilled over into other policy issues that I think that survey data that I quote in the book actually showed that third generation Mexican Americans were feeling that the discourse at the time was feeling very racist and anti-Latinx, right? So they were feeling it. And you talk to the organizers when it came to voter mobilization, they're like, this was great for us because, we're usually talking about the immigration issue as impacting one group. And we were able to mobilize second and third generation saying Latinos, they're saying like, yeah, this is about you too. This is about your last name. This is about your accent. This is about you being bilingual. And it was easy to point to examples, right? So I think that provided, I would say that's kind of like a broader kind of cultural background, in addition to a long history of anti-Mexican sentiment, right? But that was more what was happening at the time culturally in the United States. The first question you said about the older immigrant cohorts. Yeah, I mean, the demonstrations I went to were in Los Angeles, and there was a lot of grandparents there, right? And it felt like a celebration, oddly, right? There was a big, people were dancing and singing, and it felt like a fun thing going on, right? And there was a lot of elders there. It felt very safe. LAPD, I talked to the people that were working with the Los Angeles Police Department on the permits. They didn't believe anyone was going to show up. So they said, we're not going to pay overtime to send cops there. So we refused to, do it. And then when so many people showed up and the protest was down 3 major streets because it couldn't fit in one, the police were like completely overwhelmed. They're like, we would have lost complete control if this would have turned into a violent protest. But it was the opposite. It was a super celebratory and safe space, for them. I don't know if that was how the demographics were in other cities, but from pictures, it looks like they were, it was pretty mixed. I do know, though, that when I talked to non-Latinx immigrant rights organizers about the role of ethnic media in their communities, they said it was not all pro marches, and that ethnic media, I'm thinking, for example, Korean ethnic media in New York, according to the organizers there, they said they take their cue from English language media, and then they just translate those stories. Right. So it definitely wasn't as pro-immigrant as, for example, in Los Angeles ethnic media or even the television that maybe somewhere. They were all pro-immigrant. And I interviewed in my LA chapter, actually the news director of Univision in Los Angeles, who was a Mexican immigrant himself, an elite, I would say. But he said, when I moved to the United States as an adult, and I was shocked that in LA, I felt like, oh, okay, Mexicans are treated differently in this country, So even him as this elite media kind of leader felt that, and completely supported all the pro-immigrant activism that the activists that were coming onto their shows, their newscasts daily, and promoted the commercial all day long, right?
Thanks so much for those questions, Rishi. Those were great. We next have a question from Zoe Papadopoulos, Chris, who writes, if a bill like this were to be proposed today, do you think it would be racialized in the same way? And would we see the same demographic groups protesting, or do you think the makeup of the demonstrators and the movement would be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it depends on the details of the bill, right? So I think we've had plenty of examples since then of anti-immigrant laws and proposals, even Trump's border wall, that did not produce the same level of outrage and mobilization. Right? We see the crisis is happening both under the Obama and Trump administration at the border with Central American migrants, and now migrants actually from all over the world there, right? And you didn't see the same level of mobilization in the United States, even amongst immigrant rights groups, right? I think what was key about the Sensenbrenner bill is just its far-reaching nature, right? Senator Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin, I think, just kind of really overestimated. He's like, I'm going to go after everyone. And he didn't realize that also meant that you're going to mobilize everyone, you know? So I don't know if Republicans have gotten smarter, but if you look at their anti-immigrant attacks now legislatively, they're pretty focused, right? They're going to focus on asylum, or they're going to focus on the border. They're not really criminalizing the entire, you know, immigrant social infrastructure and fabrics the way they were before. So I think unless we see these kind of broad, far-reaching attacks, I wouldn't expect the same level of mobilization. Yeah, I know, probably not a popular answer, but yeah, I hope it happens again. You know.
We want the unvarnished truth here. That's okay. I guess I have a question myself, Chris, not a well-formulated one, but I am struck by, and you've kind of, you know, gestured to this a little bit throughout your talk and through the discussion, but it strikes me that the deployment of rhetorics regarding good immigrants and bad immigrants would have been something that was in the mix during this period and has obviously continued to be so. And I was hoping that you could tell us more about what you observed in your own research about how those rhetorics and the deployment of them impacted the ability for different immigrant groups or demographic entities to see themselves as, again, and you gestured to this, to be of the same, to be allies as opposed to adversaries, and the ways in which that did that change over time? How was it? How malleable was it? Obviously, Mexicans were targeted as obviously the quote unquote bad immigrant group, but I'm curious, even within the Latino community itself, how effective were and how and were those kinds of that rhetoric consumed by different demographics within the larger Latino community?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, I think everyone, you know, especially I think this generation of students that I teach, you know, when they think about immigrant activism, they think of, you know, the Dreamer movement or the undocumented youth movement, which actually came out of these protests, largely because youth were kind of excluded from leadership roles during protests, right? And a lot of the undocumented immigrant youth were like, look, we went for this comprehensive immigration reform. You adults failed at passing this law, so we're going to kind of break away and do our own kind of Dream Act thing, you know. So, and you know, and I think that's what people think of today when you think of immigrant rights activism. But movements learn, you know, and they make mistakes and they try to refine their frames, right? And one of the things they learned is a lot of the Latino immigrants here, and again, when I interview people in Fort Myers, these aren't like professional activists. They're not students. They don't know all the woke language, the framing. You know, these are just first-time participants, and a lot of them, you see it in their signs. They'll say like, "We are not terrorists." You know, why are we being attacked? You know, or you know, I pay my taxes. All this kind of like respectability, kind of like basically like I earn it. You know, but and internally in the movement, as often happens, you know, people start having discussions. You know, especially when you're trying to form diverse coalitions. Like, well, okay, if you're not the terrorist, who is? Right? You know, and everyone in the room looks at the Muslim person. You know, that's not good for forming diverse coalitions, right? So I think having those conversations, they came up and movement activists learned from those mistakes, you know, so they at least the kind of professional social movement organizations, the paid organizers, they changed their rhetoric, you know, they learned, not sure if that completely spread to like the more informal activists who are not on social media or not paying attention to, you know, these debates that were happening online. But I think, yeah, they definitely, they learn. The mainstream movement also learned that it doesn't help for the immigrant rights movement to be portrayed as a Latino movement. They spent tons of effort and time trying to do commercials with, I remember with like undocumented Irish immigrants, African immigrants being like, we're all supporting immigration reform. And they purposely made these really diverse commercials. Whenever the media wanted to do interview, they would purposely find, a white undocumented immigrant, an Asian one, an African American to talk about how his family had to flee the South and move, to the West Coast because they were also, and how that relates to migrants having to leave their countries today. So they were purposely trying to give a more diverse face to the immigrants movement. They probably failed in some respect because the American population still sees illegality as a Latino thing. But they definitely tried, right? So they all of this to say is both in terms of their rhetoric and how they try to present themselves. I think as these protest waves are dynamic and nobody was able to really control the framing. You can't control it, especially the English language media. So people also learn from them, right? And it informs their future organizing tactics and framing as well. And I think that definitely happened in 2006.
First, thanks for a fantastic talk. That was really brilliant. I was just hoping that you could maybe reflect, taking a step back on the study of social movements more broadly. In terms of an area of research, I was just wondering, what are the main influences on the way you're approaching your work, and where do you think the study of social movements is at? And going forward, what are the sort of things that you would like to see scholars focus on more? Have you got any broad thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, one, I think, at least, so there's like social movement studies and social movement theory, which is primarily dominated by like mainstream sociologists and some political scientists, but a whole bunch, everyone, all the other fields study activism as well, right? Ethnic studies, for example, is arguably a discipline that was developed and comes out of a social movement, right? But what we consider social movement theory, I think it's kind of a certain group of people are allowed into that club, right? And I'm talking about like the Tilly, Terrell, McAdams kind of school. I was a student of Sidney Terrell, if anyone knows, could be a grumpy old man and pushes you, a lot of time. And I walked in and he's like, oh, race and culture don't matter, right? And I was like, well, I'm from Los Angeles, so I mean, it kind of does over there. He also told me there was no such thing as an immigrant rights movement. And then the 2006 protests hit, and he's like, I'm on your dissertation committee. So that's the train. When I'm talking about social movement theory, that's what I'm talking about, like the Tilly, Terrell, McAdams kind of school. And I think one thing, I don't think it does a good job of theorizing race, right, really well. There's the literature on identity, but it's kind of like all identities kind of play the same role type of thing. And I think there's a lot of room to theorize things like race, gender, sexuality, and the unique ways that they could impact mobilization. I find social movement theory a little mechanical when I read these things, right? I mean, it's useful in that they develop important concepts like framing, diffusion that you could apply. But when I read some of these mainstream, I'm on these book awards all the time, I feel like they lose the passion and the excitement of social movements that you find in like, when women's studies or ethnic studies and other fields talk about it, right? They might not be as systematic and using all the jargon that social movement study scholars do. But I think that they're better at kind of like highlighting the agencies of individuals, right? So I think kind of bringing people back in and their voices and letting them be the data is super important for social movement scholars. I think especially now we got to re-theorize and understand the role of capitalism, and class on how that plays out in social movements, right? Especially in this age of inequality, we kind of, that was considered, class and unions are considered like really old movements. Now we have new social movements, and we've kind of moved away from it, right? But even when you're studying the labor movement, right, understanding race, class, sexuality is super important, right? So kind of bringing class back and intersectionality back into the studying or into the study of social movement research, I think is super important. But yeah, I think there's tons of really room for growth, in this. And I'm also, I mean, if you read other languages, I really encourage to read how people write about social movements in other countries, right? Because social movement theory was really US based and focused and really based off of the experience of the Black civil rights movement, right? And you see people try to like apply those theories to other contexts, even in other countries, and it just doesn't fit well, right? So I would kind of start with your research question and what you find exciting, and then see if any of the theories are relevant to helping you explain and understand it, So yeah, I think that's what I would say.